What I'd like to work with this afternoon is bias. It's really important to move beyond bias and the self-righteousness which is associated with bias in order to truly move into tolerance and acceptance. Tolerance and acceptance, of course, are prerequisites for compassion, and compassion is something that the planet needs a lot more of. Not sympathy, not feeling sorry for, and choosing to extend oneself then because you feel sorry for something, because it makes you feel bad. You try to make yourself feel better by doing something to fix the situation. That, of course, is probably a better situation than not being involved at all, but that really is not compassion. Compassion is truly understanding. Compassion is, through a process of empathy, coming to an understanding of why things are occurring as they're occurring, and then making an intelligent decision as to whether or not it's appropriate and for the highest good of all concerned, if that's the way you want to look at it, for you to become involved, and then choosing to become involved, choosing to engage in order to influence an outcome. So if you would look at perhaps in terms of healthy spiritual involvement, one has to completely eliminate bias. That's a big ask. It's a really, 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 really big ask. Who here feels relatively free of bias? Are you able to identify within yourself? So no one is acknowledging that. Of course, perhaps you should have said that you were relatively free of bias. That may have been the right answer. You might have just failed the test. That's a joke. So, are you able to recognise and acknowledge bias within yourself operating? Do you consider yourself to be moderately biased? Heavily biased? Can you honestly answer those questions within yourself? Because this afternoon we're going to be working with some processes which will really bring to light within yourself your bias, so that you can truly move beyond that bias and come to a place of acceptance and tolerance, which will allow compassion to come to a much higher level. I have an affectionate little blowfly who giving me kisses. I love you, but please leave. So bias. Bias would be a kind of a self-righteous condemnation. Bias would be certainly a judgment which is either based upon personal experience, and through personal experience you become anti-something and pro-something else. Or bias can be something which is more impressed upon you through the impression of significant others, parents, ideologies, political ideals, social considerations come into there as well, what's considered to be socially acceptable or not. Now, of course, ultimately, there's no wrong or right. Nothing is wrong or right. It's one thing to accept that as an intellectual necessity. It's another thing to truly operate your consciousness out of that understanding. There's no wrong or right. However, there are choices and consequences. And as you have certain goals that you want to work towards, certain choices and the consequences of those choices will be mutually exclusive to your chosen goal. So it's not to say that anything's wrong or right. However, if you have particular goals that you would like to work towards, it's wise to come to an understanding of that which is going to move you towards that goal and that which is going to take you on a circuitous path, instead of moving towards that goal, take you off on a tangent, which in the best case will simply just cost you time before that goal is achieved, and in the worst case may render you incapable in that lifetime or even beyond that lifetime of realising that goal. So you can do anything you like. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. There'll be consequences, but there's no absolute wrong, there's no absolute right. Yet contextually within that which you aspire towards and the goals that you're working towards, there is that which takes you towards the goal and that which moves you away from the goal or makes the journey to that goal much longer. Now the other side of that coin is, there's always more than one way of looking at things, just head down, charging towards the goal is not necessarily always the best way. Because if your goal is to be proficient, if your goal is to be competent in something, a certain amount of the circuitous path may actually be an advantage when you get to your destination because of the experience that you will achieve. So sometimes you're working towards a goal and you're aligning with planetary plan and purpose and universal plan and purpose. You're working with the unseen intelligences which are, through wisdom, choosing to be involved with this sphere of consciousness, to pass on what they know. And you may be aspiring towards a particular goal, and you can clearly see that goal, yet you feel very, very strongly impressed to take what seems to be a tangent. And that may be necessary in order for you to round out your development, to round out your experience, so that you have a certain amount of empathy which will allow you to be truly competent and truly wise within the capacity of that goal. Now, I'm really speaking now within the context of personal spiritual development. However, that may actually apply to a champion athlete or a business person or an academic scholar of some kind. It's certainly possible, however, not always the case. Some souls, through discipline and through the exclusion of certain choices which damage the vessel, the sacred tabernacle that we inhabit for however long, which is built out of energy given to us from the planet for a period of time to operate within, to co-create with and in. Certain choices damage the vessel physically, emotionally, or mentally, or at soul level, and tend to affect memory very strongly. And the reality is that most people, by the time they're approaching the termination of a particular embodiment, are having massive problems with their memory, still around events that have occurred in that one particular life. So it's really no surprise that in your next life you don't really remember much about anything previous to that. But if you are careful physically, emotionally, mentally, at soul level with the diet, and you keep the various elements of the four-body system strong, if you don't subject it to self-loathing, if you don't subject it to self-hatred, if you don't subject it to neurotoxins such as negative thinking or even alcohol and other things, then you will find that humility and memory improve over the life, and it becomes very easy, in fact, to carry memory over from one lifetime to the next. Now, if that's what you would like to do, if you would like to be in a situation where you have an unbroken memory consciousness in the journey through eternity, then there are certain things that are mutually exclusive to that. One of the things that you would not do if you wanted to do that was ingest alcohol. So that's an example of nurturing towards a particular goal. Now that goal is somewhat nebulous in that you would very much like to be in a situation, some number of lives or expressions of your energy in a particular realm. Down the track, you would like to be able to draw upon the acquired experience and wisdom from this life and others. So it's not even something that you're going to be able to tangibly qualify or quantify in this particular lifetime. Yet, as one becomes less enthralled with the day-to-day experience of three-dimensional existence and more focused on the eternal self and the eternal journey, such things become important. And as your priorities are changed, so then you find yourself able to release certain mutually exclusive behaviours and activities, and it's not painful to do that because you want something more. So although perhaps part of you would like to still indulge in certain behaviours or activities, the heart is ablaze with the knowing of moving towards a goal which is beyond the considerations of just this one little embodiment. And because of that, it becomes much easier to focus on goals within the eternal sense. And that's also something that we're going to be working on over the course of this intensive retreat over the next couple of weeks. It's important to come to an understanding of goals within the eternal sense. So, what I would really like you to do is to feel into within yourself a bias, a prejudice that your heart tells you is preventing you from moving your consciousness beyond the confines of this one little life. To just trust yourself, to ask yourself, not think about it. So the eyes upcast looking around the ceiling mean that you're going to think about it, consulting your little mental guru. Oh, my own little individual mind, which knows nothing else except everything that's happened since this little body was born. Tell me the answer. That's not the process. It's an allowing, a knowing. It's something that you would just know. It doesn't require any thinking. It requires an awareness. An awareness. An awareness of where your bias is. Many people who've been working on themselves for a period of time become very pro people who've been working on themselves. Linda and I tend to call that the bums on beaches syndrome. So anyone who's not conscious and working on themselves seriously, really focused on their personal growth, is a bum on the beach. Now that's a form of bias. There's religious bias. There's political bias. There's social bias. You have bias based upon race, based upon sexual orientation or activities that people are involved in. A teetotaler may be very biased against anyone who ingests alcohol. Now, well, I would say if you want to learn to allow your conscious awareness to operate beyond the confines of one particular lifetime, it would be a good idea to, not in a good or bad way, but within the context of achieving that goal, it would be a good idea to abstain from alcohol pretty much permanently. But it's not to say that alcohol is bad, and I have no bias against anyone who drinks alcohol. I may set boundaries around people who drink alcohol. If it's a serious alcoholic addiction, whereas with any addiction you need to be a little bit aware, because those people tend to be driven by the satisfaction of the addictive urge. So that may mean that they're unreliable. It may mean that they're impulsive. It may mean a lot of things that you need to be aware of, and you need to set boundaries around that. But you don't need to be biased against it. So in a sense, bias is mutually exclusive to pure awareness. And pure awareness is a type of consciousness which is also called supporting an ascended consciousness. To move into a state of pure awareness, which is free of bias. How are you going, sensing within yourself something that you're biased towards or against? So that's the other thing. You have a heavy bias against something, or you can actually have a heavy bias pro something. It's not necessarily opposing opposites. An interesting dynamic bias. You can be heavily opposed to something, yet completely ambivalent or indifferent towards everything else, which is seemingly almost the opposite. Or you can be heavily pro something, and whatever you perceive to be the other of that, you can be heavily anti. But it's not always the case. Some people are very pro something, and then anything isn't that which they are pro towards is almost completely ignored, almost beyond the person's realm of consciousness, almost excluded, blocked out. So bias can operate in many different forms, many different dynamics. It's a beautiful distraction to really acknowledging within yourself the truth of who you are right here, right now. So to feel into bias, to be brutally honest with yourself about what you may be for, what you may be against, It's not to say that you won't have opinions, but they don't need to be weighted with self-righteous condemnation or judgment. That's what discernment is. It's judgment of a sort, but it's judgment without condemnation. And an important part of pure awareness is to be in that place, to be able to judge the truth, to be able to perceive, to discern the truth, yet to not be in the position where you consider yourself to be judge and jury and to sentence that in any kind of absolute way. Would anyone like to volunteer a bias that they're aware of within themselves?
Religious leaders.
You're biased against religious leaders?
Felt into how I've done that for a long time, not just this lifetime but many others, what they represent, how they condemn. So.
Okay, so what is it that religious leaders and religious organisations challenge within you which cause you to be biased against them? Can you condense that and feel into yourself what really is driving the bias? And there's almost a little voice beneath the bias screaming something. And I can sense that within you, and I can hear that screaming. Can you identify that within yourself? Are you able to focus in and condense through the lens of that bias, like cast your consciousness back through the lens of that bias, and there will be a dynamic underneath that. In your case, I'm going to put words in your mouth, tell me if I'm wrong. I see the colour blue. Do you relate with that? No, I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. Oh, it's the number 29. Oh no, well, maybe it was another number. No. What I sense when I feel empathically through that bias that you speak of is this little voice which is screaming, "It's not fair!" Can you feel that within yourself? So it's a strongly developed sense of fair play within you which is being challenged. So for you, the issue is not so much about religious leaders, it's a lack of fairness, right? So to move beyond the bias, in your case, what you would need to do was to look at situations that you deliberately place yourself into, that you suffer in your life, that you consider to be not fair or not appropriate. In the past, go through a review process and look at situations that you've tolerated, which at a later stage you've gone, no, well, that isn't fair, and that's not something that I'm going to tolerate any longer. And to look where you treat other people unfairly. Right? And if you go through that process, then you'll find that bias will transform initially into a wariness. You'll just be particularly wary, and then after wariness you'll just achieve a space of pure awareness, when you can still be aware of, let's say, the potential failings which a lot of religious organisations may have, and you will be aware of setting certain boundaries around those kinds of people. You'll be able to recognise that, but you won't feel judgment around that. And that liberates an enormous amount of consciousness within yourself. And that applies to all of the biases that we have. What we have to do is to feel, acknowledge the bias, and you focus consciousness then almost downward through the bias, or use the bias as a lens. You need to get to the source, and you will find something which feels self-righteous, which feels as though it's been wronged somehow, feels justified in condemning, and you've got to get in contact with that dynamic and work with that dynamic and then run the cosmosis process completely around, through, within that whole dynamic. This is what I'd like to do this afternoon. So what I'm going to get you to do is to split up into groups of 3 and go through the normal process that we use, where someone's a facilitator, someone is going through the experience of working with their own bias, and the other person is holding a neutral space of tolerance and unconditional love. And then we will see how we can gently, lovingly stir you up into experiencing the dynamics of bias and how those dynamics are preventing you from fully experiencing and receiving so much. Because so much of our bias is based on perceived negative experience, or hurtful experience, as I prefer to say. Perceived hurtful experience leads to a certain bias, and that's when we start to pigeonhole, and that's when we start to generalise from the particular. Because of that particular experience, anything which appears to be like this is going to be hurtful, and I'm biased against that, and I'm going to keep that at arm's length or really push it away. And sometimes I go through an exercise of deliberately holding certain thought patterns of judgment. It might be around sexual orientation, or judgment around generalisation, like all women are bitches or whatever, and actually deliberately run that pattern and then approach someone that I'm working with and just see how close I can get to the person before they start to feel really uncomfortable. That's a technique that I use as a facilitator, because people are often in denial, or they're not willing to own or acknowledge exactly what's going on for them. So if I get a sense that they have issues and biases around a particular thing, I will deliberately start thinking that and projecting that towards them, and then approach them and see how uncomfortable they feel. And their reaction then tells me a lot about their avoidance and denial processes around that particular bias. Really, the entire cosmosis process is a systematic elimination and neutralisation of the accumulated bias of past experience, and in so doing to free up your consciousness and transform it into pure awareness. So if you were asked what the cosmosis process was about, you could say that it's about looking at the experience of past moments and the perceived hurts associated with that, and then through a process of introspection and review, eliminating those biases so that we can move into pure awareness and make intelligent decisions about who and what we are and how we want to experience life. So it's really important that you can repeat that right now, word for word. No, I'm kidding. Of course, you've got to put it into your own understanding. But really, that's what it's about. It's about getting in touch with your bias We talk about a lot within the Cosmosis process about judgment, about the elimination of judgment or the refinement of judgment into discernment, spiritual discernment. And really that's what the process is all about. Right? So let's break up into groups of 3 and be honest, right? If there's someone in the group that rubs you a little bit the wrong way, that you feel you may have some amount of bias towards, that may personify to some degree bias that you hold for or against, it may be someone that you're really particularly drawn to, and when you talk to them or hang out with them, you feel really good, but something tells you that the way you feel really good is about that person somehow reinforcing that it's okay for you to hang on to your bullshit. Or it may be a feeling of, that person just really grates on me. That's the sort of person that you want to work with in one of these triads, because that person is a beautiful mirror to show you where that bias is in, of and for love and service to all that is. So, who do you feel? You, Kim? You'd like to work with Kim?
Not really, but that's what I'd like to work with him.
Okay. So, let's break up. Let's move out. We might move outside. We'll have a bit of an experience of working with this, and Linda and I are going to assist you empathically to get in touch with some of your biases, and really that's then going to set the theme of freeing yourself from the fetters, from the entombing of your consciousness that you create with these biases. Because the biases then tend to create a lot of these dynamics within yourself where you fight internally within yourself and you argue in your head. And so to clear all of that out is really liberating consciousness.